Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I wish to welcome you in our series of lectures. As you all know, this is a youth month. This is a month dedicated in our country to youth for many reasons. Now, today we are having Malaika, who is going to be sharing with us her experiences as a young Black and intelligent young woman. Malaika is a writer. She is an activist. She goes further to assist students that have challenges in registering. This is the kind of person who we're going to be hearing from her. What challenges are faced by young Black children in our country and in our institutions of higher learning. She's going to be sharing in many aspects how do we need to deal with these challenges. Thank you very much. Over to you, Malaika.
In August of 2008, a young woman who was a student at Rhodes University in Makhanda died by suicide. Her name was Khensani Maseko, and she had written on her Twitter account on the day, prior to that rather, that she had made a statement that said, "No one deserves to be raped." And shortly after that, she wrote her date of birth and the date of death. Well, at the time, we did not know that would be the date of death, but shortly thereafter, the young woman died by suicide. And for the first time in South Africa, an important conversation that had always needed to be had was sparked. The conversation around mental health in young people. That it took the death of Khensani for this conversation to finally find its way into public discourse is, of course, a serious tragedy. However, that incident did provide our country and ourselves with an opportunity to reflect meaningfully on the mental health challenges that are being faced by young people, both in higher learning institutions as well as in society at large. And I think that was one of the most important moments in South Africa, because that was a moment where finally we could begin to have a conversation about and almost bring together the link of all the incidents, political and social incidents that had been happening over the years, which have a common thread that is fundamentally the issue of mental health. A few years prior to that, there had been protests that brought the country to its knees. Initially, the Reform movement, which was led by students in historically white institutions who were fighting against the culture of alienation and racism in historically white higher learning institutions, as well as a sense of being marginalized. And these were then followed by the Fees Must Fall movement that continues even to this day. But at the heart of the Fees Must Fall movement was firstly, the high cost of learning in South Africa. And secondly, just the nature of the coloniality of the higher learning space in the country. And what was particularly important about these protests is that while they may have begun in higher learning institutions, they ultimately opened up and began to incorporate other issues that were being faced by communities, and particularly Black communities in our country. And that is why you begin to then see movements such as the Unemployed People's Movement, EGENI, and many other organizations across the country coming into that movement and making demands or adding onto the demands that students were making, which may have seemed like they were demands about only finances, but that were fundamentally about the change of the South African academy and the change of South African society, right? A demand that the lives of Black people must begin to matter in South Africa, and a demand that communities where Black people live in South Africa must begin to receive the kind of dignified services that we see being afforded to other communities. And so the death of Khensani happens in that particular political moment, right? And we then begin to then see that intersection between the plight of students in higher learning institutions, the plight of Black students, of working class students, but just as importantly, the plight of women. And that linkage between these three struggles is at the heart of why I wrote my book titled Corridors of Power, the struggle to exist in higher learning institutions, because it was, to me at least, an attempt to open and broaden that discussion and to bring into it a history that young Black people carry on their backs, which isn't articulated when struggles of mental health are articulated or are fought within higher learning institutions and in society at large. And why is it important that we bring in history when we analyze issues of mental health in higher learning institutions? Why is it that issues around colonialism, issues of apartheid, and just the discomfort and the nervous conditions of Black people in post-apartheid South Africa, why do we need to articulate those in order to make sense of the mental health struggles that young people are facing in South Africa today? Well, it is important for a number of reasons. The first is that there is no logic in understanding the prevailing material conditions without understanding the history on which these are, on the history as a foundation on which these are built. And the foundation is important because once we understand why Black communities and Black families, right, inter alia, young Black people are going through what they are going through, we will then begin to understand how violence, right, systematic and institutionalized violence, has a root in something that demands engagement with, and that we have not afforded as sufficient sufficient attention as we ought to. We know that our history in South Africa is a history that is written in blood. We know that our history is a history that is written with the blood of Black people, of Indian people, and of colored people. We know in South Africa that this history has shaped and continues to shape the ways of life, the ways of thinking, and the ways of being for these communities that have historically been marginalized and that have historically endured unimaginable levels of violence. Now, we know also that the process of colonialism and the process of apartheid were not simply economic or political. We know that while monopolization of the economy and while spatial apartheid were fundamentally the main characteristics of colonialism and of apartheid, what we also need to look at are the psychological implications that these have had on Black people, and even as, and perhaps importantly, on the legacy and generations of Black people that emerge out of the generations of those who lived through that. And this, of course, means that to understand where we are today and why young people like myself, for example, who may not have lived through apartheid, are in fact experiencing its after effect. To understand this, we need to understand that we are products, right? We are socialized in a society and raised in homes where the people who experience this apartheid, the people who experience this level of violence are at, right? And so the mothers who raise us, the fathers who raise us are themselves holding on to the traumas of a life that was written in violence. And this then becomes imparted, not only in the ways in which they are raised, but in the ways in which our society is constructed, and therefore in the ways in which young people exist and engage in higher learning institutions, where young people like Khensani and many other young people in our country have battled with mental health issues, right? And of course, the issue of Khensani was mainly precipitated on the sexual violence that she suffered. But she became almost a symbol of the many other young people in many other higher learning institutions in our country who have died by suicide and who have died in equally tragic and preventable and devastating circumstances. And so we map this history, and we begin this history with the dispossession of Black people. We begin this history in 1652 with the arrival of settlers in South Africa. And to understand that that history of the arrival of settlers gave rise or gave birth to the beginning of a violence that continues to this day, right? There have been quite a number of works that have been done on the history of dispossession, on the frontier wars, which are obviously at the heart of violent dispossession in South Africa. And this history of the frontier wars has been written by the likes of Thembe Kagukaitobi, who in The Land Is Ours, traces very importantly the impact that the frontier wars had on Xhosa people and other peoples who are largely concentrated within the Eastern Cape province. And we also have books like The House of Phalo, which gives a very well-researched and chronological picture of what violent dispossession looked like in the Eastern Cape and in the Cape Colony and so on. And what we need to understand about these processes, right, about the frontier wars that were fought on the lands of Black people, is that at the end of these wars, two things happened. Firstly, you had the dispossession of Black people. And this dispossession obviously is a dispossession of land, is a dispossession of the economy. And by the economy, we mean all resources that were utilized at the time as a source of meaningful livelihood. This includes livestock, many other resources that were being utilized for livelihood. So this is a dispossession of all of those things, right? And the result of that is that, and the annexing of land, is that we then see Black people being held at the margins of economic existence, forced obviously into wage labor, forced into having to leave and abandon the homes, the lands that they have called home. But the second thing that happens in that process is that we also then begin to see the mental health pathologies of Black people, which have not yet been documented as intentionally, begin to rise. Because what that process of dispossession, what the annexing of land does, is that it takes away fundamentally a people's source of identity and a people's source of security. And when you take away a people's sense of identity and a people's sense of security, what you fundamentally do is that you hurl them into a zone of non-being, a zone into which their humanity and their humanness have been dislodged from their very existence. And they live, therefore, as people who have been, for lack of a better word, animalized in that space, because you hurl them into a zone where they need to fight for very limited resources amongst themselves, in the absence of the existence of other resources that can sustain them. And so the birth of very intense, violent competition begins to emerge. And of course, this is not to say there had not been in the past wars of competition and resources and so on. But when resources are abundant, it is a very different texture of conflict that exists, as opposed to when people are forced into a zone where they need to survive. And this continues in South Africa beyond the frontier wars. It continues into the Union of South Africa, the formation of the Union of South Africa in 1910. And what the Union of South Africa in 1910 does, which is absolutely devastating and which is very important to understand if we were to understand what is happening today with young people, is that it then sets parameters for the development of legislation that says that a South Africa that Black people had known to be their home, a world in which they had buried their ancestors, performed their rituals, and lived their entire existence, is no longer their home. This is no longer a place where Black people can live and can exist. They are no longer South African. They are people who live on the margins. And so you see later on with the creation of development of legislation that cements that logic, right? In 1950, you have the Group Areas Act that delineates land in South Africa to say this is where people of various races can reside, and the best parts of the land are given to white people in South Africa. So Black people, colored people, and Indian people basically are forced to scrape at the bottom of the barrel in terms of land in which they can live. And what that then does is that it creates zones within South Africa where two worlds exist: a world of white privilege, a world of opulence, resource, abundance, and development, and another world in which Black people are held, which is a world of neglect, a world of underdevelopment, and a world fundamentally where human life is not valued, right? And you don't value human life when you don't dedicate resources to it. You don't value human life when you deny it the right to exist self-sufficiently, right? And by this, I mean, when you dispossess Black people of land, you basically de-agrarianize them. You take away their ability to exist as agrarian societies that had always defined their way of life. And so then such process, you begin to then see a development of such things as the migrant labor system. Because once you've taken Black people out of the zones in which they can make a living, once you've taken them away from the land that they have always toiled and worked on, they get forced to go and work in order to take care of themselves and of their families. And the migrant labor system then emerges in that kind of space. And the migrant labor system in particular is very, very important to understand if we are to understand where we are today. Because the migrant labor system not only takes Black people out of their homes and forces them into cities to work for the development of white communities and to build a white economy, but what it does is that it also disintegrates and fundamentally collapses the idea of the Black of communities, because men are held into the cities to go and work, leaving behind women to take care of children in a very difficult circumstances where they themselves are unable to generate a meaningful livelihood. And the men are locked into hostels in cities like Johannesburg, in cities like Cape Town and Durban. And within, they live in hostels where women, they don't get to be with their families, they don't get to be with anyone except to be by themselves. Back home, you have left women to raise children on their own with very limited support. And in the cities, you have held Black people to live together like sardines, really, in very unhygienic spaces, in spaces that are not fit for human habitat. And so that destruction of the Black family begins there, and of Black communities, because once these men are in these cities and in these urban spaces, they need to find ways to be alive. And being alive is not only working, how they interact, how they socialize, and their life, the leisure that they are able to find in those spaces, then becomes naturally, as human beings, because we are social beings and we rely on each other and we rely on relations, they build relationships with the women that they find working in the cities. These may be the domestic workers or women who are doing work within these white communities, and it must be stated that it is very precarious work. So you then see men begin to develop these relationships to build new families with other women and so on, living, of course, with their wives and their families having been left behind at home. And so that system of the destabilization of the family unit, right? That system of the destabilization of communities means that the children who are left behind in the so-called Bantustans, where Black people were forced into, are growing up without fathers, and therefore do not have the kind of modeling that is required to raise, children who are, truly completely taken care of and completely well parented. And of course, this is not to say single parents don't parent well, but the difficulties that come with raising a child on your own express themselves particularly in that kind of an environment. And so a culture of Black children growing up without their fathers, a culture of Black women being forced to become single parent emerges in that kind of a space, right? And it continues obviously into the democratic South Africa, where even though we do see that there has been some degree of political changes on certain things, the economic texture of South Africa in post-1994 dispensation continues to be that way. And the impact of that destruction of the family unit is itself also still continuing, right? Because the families have been established in the cities, the families also still then do exist in the former homelands and so on. And so that kind of legacy still continues because the children there have grown up without the father and so on, right? Now we enter into post-1994. And this is a South Africa that promises to be a whole new world. We are building a new world. We are collapsing this idea of two nations that exist alongside each other, but that are very fundamentally different in terms of their texture. But in this new South Africa, it comes carrying on its back a baggage filled with all of those historical processes of violence, of marginalization, and of segregation. And so children who are born into this new South Africa are born to mothers and fathers of that age, right? Of the violence, of the segregation, of the alienation that was experienced in those processes that I have just very briefly highlighted. And what does then that look like, right? That looks like children who are born already into a space of trauma. And the trauma is then elevated, and it's therefore elevated and deepened by the material conditions of this new South Africa, into which the children of those same men and women are still on the receiving end of exclusion and alienation. So these are children like ourselves, born in the 1990s and so on, to mothers who had been denied, and mothers and grandmothers and families who had been denied the right to exist as truly human. And we are born then into this world, raised into this world, and socialized into that space. And this is a world also, remember, like I said, where because there has been spatial discrimination over a long period of time, Black people still continue to be staying in spaces that are still underdeveloped, still not taken care of, still not fit for human habitat. The informal settlements where Black people live, the townships where Black people live, lacking in the most basic of resources that are required to sustain life. And so these are the spaces where we grow up. And this is a space where I personally grew up, right? As a young girl born in the 1990s in Soweto, right? A grandmother who too has known pains of eviction, pains of being forced to be out of a space that was once called home. And this is a story of many young Black people in South Africa, because many of us are products of that kind of a geo-history, or at least our parents and grandparents are a product of that kind of a geo-history. And we then grow up in these communities, and for me, that community is Soweto, Meadowlands. And the legacy of the violence exists in that space. So if you were growing up in Meadowlands in the mid to late 1990s, like I did, you would have known that in Meadowlands, there was only, if you were living in Zone 8 Meadowlands, for you to be able to access a library to read or to do your schoolwork, you would have needed to walk almost 30 minutes to the library in Zone 1 Meadowlands, Zone 2 Meadowlands by Mabedi Hall, Meadowlands Library. It is a library very far away that must cater for the entire Meadowlands community, which is comprised of multitudes of people. And it is in fact the biggest township within Soweto, Meadowlands. And that one library must serve everyone in there. But when you get into that library, it is also not well resourced. So you don't have things like your laptops and your functional network and Wi-Fi and so on. And that is the space where we grow up in. And it is that way precisely because there has been a systematic underdevelopment and underfunding of areas where Black people have lived over a long period of time. So we grow up, and those are the resources that are available to us as young Black people now who are growing up in this so-called post-apartheid South Africa. But we also grow up in South Africa where our parents do not have access to land. And this is a very strange thing, because very often when we speak about land issues, it is rural land that is at the center of the discussion. But issues around urban land aren't necessarily as well articulated or well researched as they ought to be, because it is assumed that land applies only to agricultural land that is required for agrarian reform. But the issue of human settlements in urban areas is a very serious issue, because within these spaces, it is a site of multiple layers of violence that do exist, right? In the townships where we grew up and where I grew up, for example, in Middlelands, you did have some formal dwellings, but you also had a lot of informal dwellings within those formal dwellings. And this was the result, firstly, of course, of limited land access for Black people. That was very deliberate and intentional. But secondly, of the fact that even those formal households had very limited or little income. And so in order to generate more income, or just to sustain livelihoods in a society where Black people don't have resources and don't have access, and unemployment is especially rife in those communities, they then allow informal dwellings to be erected within these formal settings. And that is where many of us then grow up in, right? So that is how you see, for example, how the legacy of landlessness impacts those of us who are born in the post-democratic South Africa, right? That the issue of urban land finds expression in that sense, right? But so we grow up in spaces that are lacking in terms of resources, libraries, and so on, in spaces where the land question has not been resolved, and therefore we see the manifestation of its legacy in various forms, and in the fact that we still get to live in places that are not fit for human habitat, even in this new South Africa. But the third and other salient issue is that we are also then raised in families that are lacking with resources, right? And this obviously is part of the things that precipitates fees must fall much later. But I, for example, grew up with a grandmother who was a domestic worker, and my mother who only completed a matric and had to work within the NGO space. Money was very limited, resources were very scarce, and we had to make do with whatever little was available there. And it is not my story alone, it is a story of many other young Black people. Fourthly, and most importantly, is that within the space then that we negotiate and grow up in, we too become required to function, right? And so in situations where we become slightly a bit more privileged, that we're able to then go to universities or to go to schools and so on, we then bring into those spaces those realities that we are confronted with at home as people born in post-apartheid South Africa, right? The realities of neglect, the realities of underdevelopment, the realities of poverty, the realities of landlessness, and so on. And we enter into these higher learning institutions, and these are reproduced, right? These are reproduced in a sense that the higher learning institutions into which we enter also perpetuate the neglect, the dislocating of self, and more importantly, the violence that we have known and that we have carried with us into these spaces. Now, I ask this question in my book: how is it possible then that in a world that is constructed in that way, that Black people who enter higher learning institutions would not have mental health pathologies? Because these are mental health pathologies that are carried from the home, from the community into these spaces, and are worsened by the alienating culture, by the racist culture then of these spaces, right? It is not possible that a people can endure that level of violence for so long over various generations and not have a sense of debilitation, I would say, that precipitated the start of the roads must fall and the fees must fall movement. And so the fees must fall and the roads must fall movement, as I argue in the corridors of power, are in fact a logical conclusion to these many years and generations and centuries of trauma and centuries of violence. And of course, when I speak about violence, I'm often requested to explain what I mean by this, right? Because we often think of violence as force, use of force, and it's very physical, and it's people beating each other and so on. We think about it that way. And that is why even when we talk about the violence of apartheid or the violence of colonialism, often it is the frontier wars that are spoken about and the killings and June 16 and so on, because that's our idea of violence. That's what we think of violence as it being physical. But violence, of course, we know is far deeper than that, right? Violence is psychological. Violence is financial and economic. violence is also very deeply emotional and mental, of course, right? Because even if as a mother you were not being, you were not enduring, say, the beatings and the incarcerations that someone like Mama Winnie Madikizela Mandela would have experienced, to just be a parent living in South Africa in 1984 and to not know whether or not your child is going to be coming back from school, to not know whether or not your child is safe, and to know every day that Black children are being killed, are being incarcerated, and are being tortured, and you live every day with that, sitting and hoping every day that your child comes back home, it gives birth to a certain level of unimaginable trauma that a mother would have to go through, to know every day when your child walks out the door that might be it might be the very last time you see them, is trauma. But to also be a child who is denied of their childhood brings about a level of trauma. And that is the reality that I think is very prevalent with many of our parents. And I make this argument in my book that one of the biggest challenges that Black parents face, or that we see in South Africa today, is that many of our parents did not have a childhood. And the childhood that they had is one that they are, even as adults, battling to recover from. Because these were children who, at the age of 12, at the age of 11, at the age of 13, were having to run every time they hear a gunshot. We're having to wake up every day to play on the streets where, alongside huge military and police vans and so on. These were children that had to see their fathers and their mothers having their pants stripped down and put on their knees, because that was what apartheid system did, just to humiliate and dehumanize, right? These are our mothers. These are the people who are raising us with that trauma. And that trauma, of course, has not healed. They have not received any psychological counseling. They've not received any help, meaningful help, really. And even processes such as the TRC, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, that was meant to bring about some kind of closure, were insufficient. And we know this because we know that a lot of people in that process were allowed to get away with far more than it should have been allowed. And a lot of these people also have not paid the price that I think an oppressed people demand to see if they are to begin a meaningful quest for healing and a journey of truly getting over the pain that they would have endured. Because we must never underestimate the extent to which people not being given a space to heal their trauma by seeing justice being done can be very damaging. And TRC, while it may have had its own benefits, was also an exercise in injustice for many, many, many other Black people. Many of them, even to this day, still have not had questions that have been answered about their loved ones who have died, but about their own traumas that they too would have experienced. So there has not been, in post-apartheid South Africa, a deliberate attempt at healing the traumas that Black people have endured, right? And these then carry over into the children that are raised by these persons who are in that, who have experienced that level or that depth of violence and trauma. And they raise us, we go into these higher learning institutions, and these higher learning institutions themselves are not making any meaningful attempt at resolving the issues of trauma that are deeply embedded into the psyche and the lives of young Black people. And an example of this that I make is with an institution, for example, like Rhodes University. The very fact that we know that Makhanda is what we refer to that as a frontier county, because that is where a lot of the frontier wars took place. And in fact, those of you who have been to Rhodes University will know that when we graduate at Rhodes University, we graduate at a building called the Monument. It's a huge building that oversees the entirety of Makhanda, formerly known as Grahamstown. And that was an establishment for colonial armies. We have at Rhodes University a place that has been turned into a coffee shop. I forget the name now, but it has been turned into a coffee shop. But that was in fact a jail at some point. That was a jail at some point. And today even in terms of its architecture, it's built in the form of a panopticon, right? Which is like an encircled, a very round building where soldiers sit at the top and they are able to view the prisoners from the top and to have a clear 360-degree view of prisoners at the bottom. That is a history that institutions like Rhodes University have, right? A history that is very deeply embedded in the torture and the violence of Black people. And this is also an institution where young Black people must also then go into to learn and to study, right? And every day when you are within the space of that institution, in order for you to meaningfully survive, you must, at the very least, pretend to not see that kind of violence and to not remember it and to not remember how it has impacted your loved ones, your families, and your communities, right? And we are requiring that the Black people who are today living in Makhanda must exist in that space, must work within that space, and must feel nothing. And that, of course, is not possible. And that is why you then had such a thing as Rhodes Must Fall. Rhodes Must Fall, contrary to the narrative that has been postulated, particularly by media, that seeks to say students were simply wanting to change names of institutions and throwing feces at statues. Those things were only a symbol of the deeper underlying issues that students were raising. And the deeper underlying issues was this, that a South Africa that is intentional about transforming and changing cannot continue to be a South Africa where monuments that traumatize Black people are held up as symbols of success and of glory. That Rhodes University cannot exist in Makhanda, where many people, many Black people, have seen their grandfathers, their grandmothers, their great-grandfathers, and many of their ancestors killed and destroyed by such people as Rhodes, by such people as Lord Graham. So it was a struggle that was about bringing the dignity of Black people at the center.
We have to take a break. You're giving us such a full and very powerful lecture.